on before the Subcommittee on Medical Facilities and Benefits of the Committee on Veterans Affairs, House of Representatives, 95th Congress, on herbicide Agent Orange, October 11th, 1978. In this hearing, Alvin Young was present. Let's look for Mr. Young. I'm not sure if he was a lieutenant or a captain at the time. Here he is. He was a captain in 1978. And let's look at what he had to say about Agent Orange. Here's a statement of Major General Garth Didinger, and he was the Deputy Surgeon General at the time of the Air Force, and he was accompanied by Captain Alvin Young from the U.S. Air Force Occupational and Environmental Health Laboratory at Brooks Air Force Base in Texas, and Tom Daschle, Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense Research and Engineering. And at this time, Captain Young had a Ph.D. in plant physiology, and he'd been with the herbicide program in the Air Force for at least 10 years. At this time in 1978, they were testing at Eglin Air Force Base to see about the degradation of dioxin at the Eglin test facilities. And they recognized that there might be a remote possibility for long-term effects with dioxin alone. And we know how Vietnam turned out. In 1978, they asked, are there any ongoing studies in the Department of Defense on the question of health effects, possibly long-range health effects of dioxin or 2,4-D or 2,4,5-T? And General Didinger said, we have none, at least in the Air Force, ongoing at the present time. No, sir. So by 1978, we'd all been to most of us had been to Panama and back already, and we weren't sick yet, but they didn't know because they hadn't even started studying people by this time in 1978. Captain Young says that the first studies were reported in the Journal of Science in 1970, the work by Courtney et al. She reported, in fact, 2,4,5-T was very teratogenic, but I think the most important thing to remember is in the footnote at the end of her publication. In the postscript, she indicated that upon analysis of the 2,4,5-T was found to contain 28 parts per million TCDD. Subsequent to that, there has been a lot of additional work done, and we find that it is very difficult to get, quote, purified 2,4,5-T. Small amounts of TCDD in 2,4,5-T will cause teratogenicity, birth defects in laboratory animals. Wanted to point out in this study by Courtney et al. In 1970, the 2,4,5-T dioxin was 28 parts per million. Colonel Baer stated in response to various questions that the DoD never contracted with chemical companies to have the components of Agent Orange specially made for the DoD. And yet we've been told by Dr. Young that there was something special about the tactical version versus the commercial version. And yet we see that Dr. Young, as a captain, was here at the hearing in 1978 when Colonel Baer stated in response to several questions that the DoD never contracted with chemical companies to have the components of Agent Orange specially made for the DoD. These are the minutes of the ad hoc VACO Advisory Committee on Herbicides, the meeting of July 7th, 1978. And in attendance is Alvin Young, as well as others. In this report, Dr. Holder pointed out that it's important to distinguish between the health effects of the individual herbicides and their contaminants. These chemicals are not necessarily capable of the same biological action. This is especially true for the dioxins, of which there are many variants. The 2878 tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, TCDD, appears to be the most toxic. Some of the misunderstanding about the toxicity of dioxin stems from failure to differentiate one dioxin type from another. For the Vietnam War herbicide issue, the proper dioxin, TCDD, is of relevance. It is also important to realize that not all herbicides contain dioxins, and when present, the dioxin is not always in the same amount. The 2,4,5-T supplied to the military during the Vietnam War had concentrations of TCDD varying from 1 part per million parts per million to about 50 parts per million. The phenoxy herbicide was a standard grade agricultural product. And yet Dr. Young has written in the Panama report that it was of military specifications, and that simply doesn't seem to be true.